The thing is, I am still that little kid that grew up in Liverpool. Okay, I got really famous, but in here, I'm still that little kid. So I'm amazed at like the audience reaction and stuff, and because it's like I still don't believe it, and the way I think, just like when I'm at home,
yes,
I'm just slobbing out watching television.
Paul McCartney is worth over $1.2 billion today, making him one of the richest musicians who ever lived. But what most people don't know is that his incredible wealth came from a childhood filled with poverty and heartbreak. And right now, at 83 years old, he's facing something that terrifies him more than anything: the fear of forgetting the voices of everyone he's lost. His story begins on June 18, 1942, in Liverpool, England, right after World War II, when the city was covered in rubble from German bombing, and his family lived in a tiny house with barely enough money for food. His father, Jim, was a struggling jazz musician, and his mother, Mary, worked as a nurse, and despite being poor, they filled their home with music and laughter. But everything changed in 1956 when Paul was only 14 years old, and his mother suddenly died from breast cancer, leaving a hole in his heart that never healed. Paul later said, "One minute she was there, the next she was gone." And this loss affected every song he would ever write, including Let It Be, where Mother Mary wasn't a religious figure, but his own mom appearing in his dreams. After his mother died, his father encouraged Paul to pour his grief into music, and when Paul was 15, he met another boy named John Lennon, who had also lost his mother young, and they connected immediately because they both understood that emptiness. They started writing songs together in their tiny homes, just two poor kids from Liverpool trying to make sense of grief through music, and they formed a band with other teenagers that eventually became the Beatles, though nobody thought they would succeed because they were too young and too poor. To get better at performing, the band went to Hamburg, Germany, where they played in dirty nightclubs for 8 hours straight, sleeping in rooms infested with bugs and taking pills to stay awake, eating whatever cheap food they could afford, while audiences of drunk sailors jeered at them. This brutal schedule nearly killed them, but made them incredible musicians. And just when things were improving, their bass player Stuart Sutcliffe suddenly died from a brain hemorrhage at only 21 years old in 1962, devastating the band and forcing Paul to take over on bass guitar, even though it reminded him of his dead friend. By 1963, the Beatles exploded into worldwide fame with Beatlemania, making Paul, John, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr the most famous people on the planet. But this overwhelming attention was crushing for Paul, who was barely in his 20s and started using drugs to cope with the constant pressure and loneliness of being watched by millions. The Beatles wrote incredible songs like Yesterday, Hey Jude, Let It Be, and Blackbird that changed music history. But behind the scenes, the pressure was destroying them, especially after their manager Brian Epstein died in 1967, and Paul tried to take over leadership, creating terrible tension with John. Then came one of the strangest experiences of Paul's life. In 1966, a bizarre rumor spread that Paul had died in a car crash and been replaced by a look-alike, and fans obsessively searched for clues in Beatles songs, and Paul later said watching the world mourn him while he was alive did psychological damage that never went away. By 1969, the tension became unbearable, and John told Paul he was leaving, and on April 10, 1970, Paul publicly announced the Beatles were breaking up, devastating millions of fans worldwide, but breaking Paul's heart most of all because the Beatles had been his family since he was a teenager. Paul fell into deep depression, retreating to his farm in Scotland, drinking heavily and wondering if he even wanted to make music anymore, and he and John started attacking each other through cruel songs instead of talking like they used to. In 1970, Paul recorded an album by himself called McCartney, where he played every instrument alone, and critics said it was terrible and his career was over, but he slowly recovered and formed a new band called Wings in 1971 with his wife Linda, though everyone mocked them and said Paul would never be as good without John. Wings struggled for years with critics who hated them and audiences who were skeptical, but Paul kept pushing forward even when it meant losing money, and then in 1977, Wings released Mull of Kintyre that became the best-selling single in British history and finally proved Paul could succeed without the Beatles. The most important person through all this struggle was his wife Linda McCartney, who he married in 1969, right before the Beatles broke up, and she became his best friend and anchor, learning to play keyboards so she could perform with him even though critics constantly made fun of her talent. They had 4 children together and tried to live normally on their farm in Scotland despite Paul's fame, and Linda stood by him through the Beatles' breakup, through the struggles of Wings, through everything. But then, in 1995, Linda was diagnosed with breast cancer at age 53, the same disease that killed Paul's mother when he was 14. And suddenly, Paul was living his worst nightmare all over again. Watching Linda fight cancer for 3 years was like being dragged back to being a scared 14-year-old watching his mother die. And when Linda died on April 17, 1998, at age 56, Paul, at 55 years old, lost his best friend and the person who had kept him sane for 30 years. The grief was so overwhelming that Paul couldn't go into certain rooms of their house because everything reminded him of Linda. And he would take long walks alone, crying for hours, throwing himself into activism for causes she cared about, like vegetarianism and animal rights, to keep her spirit alive. In 1999, Paul met Heather Mills and they married in 2002, having a daughter named Beatrice in 2003, which gave Paul hope for a new start. But this marriage was completely different from his quiet life with Linda. It was loud, public, and full of drama with constant tabloid stories and fighting. By 2006, their marriage was falling apart, and when they divorced in 2008, it became a huge public spectacle, with Heather demanding hundreds of millions, lawyers fighting in court, and cameras capturing every humiliating moment, with the judge awarding her $24 million. Paul said that unlike Linda's death, which was private sacred grief, his divorce from Heather was chaos and exhausting public humiliation that left different scars than loss through death. During his years of fame, Paul also struggled with substance use starting in the 1960s when the Beatles took pills to stay awake during marathon shows and later experimented with drugs to cope with pressure, getting arrested several times, including spending 9 days in a Japanese jail in 1980. But the turning point came in 2015 when Paul was 73 and decided to completely stop all drug use because he wanted to be a good example for his grandchildren. After his painful divorce, Paul found love again with Nancy Shevell, marrying her in 2011 when he was 69, and this quiet, stable relationship gave him the peace he had been missing since Linda died, with friends noticing Paul seemed calmer and happier than he'd been in years. Today, at 83 years old in 2025, Paul still performs concerts around the world to sold-out arenas where fans from teenagers to great-grandparents sing songs written decades ago, and he lives between homes in London, Sussex, and the Hamptons, surrounded by memories of his journey from poor Liverpool boy to music legend. His $1.2 billion fortune comes not just from concerts, but from royalties his songs earn every day. Every time Yesterday plays on the radio, every time someone covers Let It Be, Paul earns money even while sleeping, and he's donated over $100 million to charities supporting environmental causes, animal rights, and music education. The most amazing thing about Paul's story isn't his success or fortune, but that he survived so much loss without becoming bitter, losing his mother at 14, watching friends die young, enduring the Beatles' breakup, suffering through Linda's death, surviving a terrible divorce, and struggling with fame and substance use. Yet he kept creating music and kept finding reasons to believe life was worth living, At 83, Paul worries about his memory and fears the day when he might not recall the voices of his mother, Linda, John Lennon, and George Harrison, who have all passed away. But he fights that fear by staying active, performing, and creating new music that proves his mind is still sharp. His life teaches us that real strength isn't about being tough or never showing emotion. It's about getting knocked down again and again, but choosing to stand back up, to keep loving even when love has hurt you, to keep creating even when you doubt yourself, and to keep believing tomorrow might be better than today. And Paul McCartney turned his childhood poverty into motivation, his mother's death into beautiful songs, his grief over Linda into activism that helps others, and his mistakes into lessons that made him wiser and more compassionate, proving that the boy who started with nothing but a cheap guitar in a tiny Liverpool house could become not just a billionaire, but someone whose music has comforted millions of people through their own hard times across generations around the entire world.